Tonight, I'm sharing 4 stories that will make you think twice about visiting Colorado's abandoned ghost towns. The first takes place in St. Elmo, a mining town frozen in time, where one visitor swears he saw something no one alive should have been able to light. And before we begin, if stories like this keep you hooked, subscribe and ring the bell. I post new nightmare fuel every single day. This account comes from Ben, a history teacher from Kansas, who spent summers hiking through the Rockies. He wasn't the kind of person to scare easily. His interests leaned toward old architecture and forgotten history, and he'd often plan road trips around exploring ghost towns. His wife teased him that he preferred the company of boarded-up buildings to beaches. That summer, he set his sights on St. Elmo, one of the best-preserved mining towns in Colorado. St. Elmo sits tucked in the Sawatch Range, about 10,000 feet up, its false front buildings still standing, though most have sagged and warped under a century of snow. The general store remains, closed but intact. The hotel looks as if it might topple if you breathed too hard, and the wooden sidewalks creak even under your imagination. St. Elmo hasn't had residents in decades, though tourists wander through in daylight. By nightfall, it empties completely. Ben arrived late afternoon, snapping pictures as the sun dipped behind the ridges. The streets lay empty except for chipmunks darting across boards and the faint creak of weathered shutters in the wind. He wandered past the silent saloon, past cabins with curtains still drawn, and imagined the voices of miners who once filled the town with noise and light. By 7 o'clock, most daylight had faded. He knew he should return to his car. There were no hotels here, no campgrounds within the town itself. But he lingered. The quiet fascinated him. How an entire community could sit intact yet hollow, like a stage with the actors gone. He set up his tripod across from the old Stark Brothers store, framing a long shot of the main street under the growing dusk. As he adjusted the exposure, he froze. One of the upper windows in the long-abandoned hotel across the street glowed faintly. At first, he thought it was sunlight catching glass, but the angle was wrong. The sun had already dropped behind the ridge. The glow flickered, rising and falling in brightness, yellow-orange in hue. It looked exactly like the flame of an oil lamp. Ben lowered his camera and stared. The hotel had been boarded for decades. No electricity. No caretaker lived in town after hours. The nearest ranger station was miles away, yet the light burned steady, bobbing slightly as if carried by someone moving behind the glass. He swallowed hard, telling himself it had to be a reflection from his own gear, a trick of his tired eyes. He raised the camera again, zoomed in on the window. The lens showed it clearly, a round glow, faint haloed edges, shifting gently as if a flame played inside. And then, movement. For a fraction of a second, he saw a figure's shadow pass across the light, a human silhouette in a window of a building that should have been empty for 70 years. His stomach tightened. He wanted to tell himself it was a trespasser, maybe another tourist staying late. But the thought made no sense. Every door was padlocked, boards nailed firm across lower windows. And he'd heard no car, no footsteps, no sound but the wind in the eaves. Ben lifted the camera again, snapping shot after shot. Each frame captured the lamp, glowing faintly in the upstairs window. But the shadow didn't return. He debated leaving, but something about the light rooted him. Curiosity warred with unease. Against his better judgment, he crossed the street, wooden boards groaning under his boots as he approached the hotel. The building loomed above him, its clapboard siding gray with age, shutters sagging. Up close, the glow seemed brighter, spilling faint warmth onto the glass of the upper pane. Ben called out, "Hello?" His voice echoed down the empty street. No answer. He circled the building. Every door padlocked, boards solid. He pressed a hand to the wood, cold to the touch, dry and brittle. No way anyone had entered recently. Yet the light persisted, shifting faintly as though the lamp wick were being adjusted. The longer he stared, the more wrong it felt. The flame didn't flicker in time with wind or draft. It pulsed, slow and deliberate, like breathing. His camera hung useless at his side now. He couldn't bring himself to raise it again. Then, clear as day, the curtain behind the glowing window twitched. Something on the inside pulled it back, just enough to reveal the dark outline of a face. Ben stumbled backward. The lamplight flared suddenly, flooding the entire window, brighter than before. For one unbearable moment, it felt as though it had fixed itself on him, burning with intention. He turned and bolted down the street, boards groaning under his flight, breath tearing in the thin mountain air. His car sat a half-mile back, parked by the trailhead. He didn't stop until he reached it, throwing gear into the back seat with trembling hands. When he dared glance back at the hotel, the window was dark. The next day he returned with a friend from Buena Vista, determined to prove he hadn't imagined it. They entered during daylight with permission from the caretaker. Dust lay thick across the floorboards. No footprints but their own. Upstairs, every room sat bare, curtains hanging shredded. And in the room with the window, the sill was coated with decades of grime. No oil lamp, no soot, no matches. Just an old rocking chair in the corner, tilted slightly forward as though someone had just stood up. Ben swore the smell of lamp oil lingered faintly in the air, though his friends said he noticed nothing. He left St. Elmo that afternoon, but the photographs remained. When he reviewed them later, every frame showed the glow in the upstairs window, but in one, the faintest outline of a hand pressed against the glass, fingers spread wide, as though reaching outward. Ben never returned to St. Elmo. And whenever people ask him about ghost towns, he tells them they're worth the visit in daylight, but not at night. Never at night. The second story takes place in Ashcroft, a silver boom town that collapsed almost overnight, leaving behind a main street of sagging saloons and rotting cabins where the silence can feel heavier than the mountains above. One photographer thought he was simply chasing the beauty of decay, but what he heard inside that silence followed him for years. And before we begin, if stories like this keep you hooked, subscribe and ring the bell. I share new chilling encounters every single day. This account comes from Daniel, an amateur photographer from Denver who had a habit of disappearing into the mountains with nothing but his camera and a backpack. Ashcroft had been on his list for years. It was less commercial than St. Elmo or Central City, quieter, less polished, and somehow more honest in its ruin. He had read that at its height in the 1880s, Ashcroft boasted 24 saloons, a handful of hotels, and a bustling population of nearly 2,500. By the turn of the century, fewer than 100 remained. Now it was nothing but skeletons of buildings clinging to the valley floor, preserved just enough for tourists to wander in daylight, but at night it belonged to the wind and the trees. Daniel drove up one autumn afternoon, the aspens blazing yellow, the air sharp with the scent of pine and frost. He parked near the entrance, shouldered his pack, and walked into town with the sun lowering fast behind Castle Creek Valley. The main street stretched quiet and empty, its dirt ruts baked hard, flanked by saloons and boarding houses whose windows gaped like empty eyes. He was struck immediately by how intact the street still felt, as if a crowd might round the bend at any moment and bring the town back to life. He set up his tripod near the saloon, trying to capture the way the slanted light cut through broken windows and painted gold stripes across dusty floors. The silence was absolute, broken only by the click of his shutter and the crunch of gravel under his boots. He told himself he would stay only until twilight, but when he saw how the sky ignited in red and violet over the peaks, he couldn't resist pushing deeper, carrying his camera down the line of buildings as shadows swallowed the valley. By the time he reached the last saloon, darkness had fallen fully. The wooden frame leaned precariously, its sign long rotted away, door hanging off one hinge. He hesitated, then ducked inside. His flashlight beam danced across a room filled with collapsed tables, a bar scarred with decades of dust, and shards of broken bottles glittering faintly in the beam. Daniel crouched to frame a low shot of the bar, the flashlight clipped to his pack, casting just enough glow for his lens. That's when he heard it. A whisper. Faint, deliberate, just behind his left shoulder. He froze, heart stuttering. He swung the light around. Empty. Only dust motes spinning in the air. He exhaled slowly, convincing himself it was wind through a crack. He steadied his camera and tried again. The whisper came back. This time, clearer. It wasn't wind. It was words. He swore it sounded like, "Don't stay." His throat tightened. He turned the light again, sweeping the walls. Nothing but warped boards and collapsed rafters. Still, he packed up, deciding he'd had enough. But as he stepped toward the door, another whisper slid through the room. It came from the back of the saloon, near a doorway that led to a dark hall. He raised his light and saw movement. A shadow, tall and narrow, crossing the hall, vanishing before the beam could settle. Daniel staggered backward, the tripod clattering to the floor. His breath echoed too loud in the room, masking the sound of more whispers. Layered now, more than one voice, overlapping in a tangle of words he couldn't catch. He bolted into the street, sucking in the cold mountain air. The sky above was moonless, the valley drowned in darkness, the outline of the mountains barely visible. But the whispers followed. Not out loud, not from behind, but from inside his head, as though the saloon's walls had etched them into his hearing. Faint phrases swirled in his skull. Go back, stay, listen. Contradictory, endless. He stumbled toward the car, every step heavier. The main street stretched impossibly long now, as though the buildings had multiplied, repeating themselves, trapping him in an ending corridor of empty facades. He blinked hard, shook his head, and when his vision cleared, the street was normal again, only 10 buildings in a row. But the whispers hadn't stopped. At the car, his hands shook so hard he dropped his keys twice before getting the door open. He slammed it shut, the silence inside the cab deafening compared to the flood of voices moments before. For a long time, he sat there, forehead pressed against the wheel, waiting for his breath to steady. When he finally dared glance back toward the saloon, its windows glowed faintly with a pale light. Not lamplight, not fire, just a cold sheen like moonlight, though the moon hadn't risen. And in that glow, he thought he saw shapes moving, dozens of them. A crowd gathered just inside, whispering still, though he could hear nothing through the glass. He drove away faster than he should have on a mountain road, and he didn't stop until Aspen's lights appeared in the valley below. Weeks later, when he developed his photos, he found one frame that made his stomach twist. The shot of the saloon interior, the one he had crouched low to capture, showed not only the collapsed bar and dust-choked air, but also a figure standing in the doorway at the back. Tall, narrow, blurred, like a person caught mid-step. And though the photo was silent, every time Daniel looked at it, he swore he could hear the whisper again. The third story comes from Nevadaville, a once thriving mining settlement tucked high in the Rockies, where a group of urban explorers pried open a building they shouldn't have and discovered a room that seemed untouched by time, as if its owners had stepped away only minutes before. And before we begin, if stories like this keep you on edge, subscribe and ring the bell. I post new chilling encounters every single day. This account comes from Alex, a 29-year-old photographer and writer who often sought out abandoned places for his blog. He wasn't reckless, at least that's what he told himself. He usually went with a small group of like-minded friends, always respectful, never stealing, never vandalizing, just documenting. But when they reached Nevadaville one fall afternoon, what they found challenged every idea Alex had about abandoned spaces. Nevadaville lies a mile above Central City, clinging to the mountainside at nearly 9,000 feet. In its heyday in the 1860s, it had hundreds of buildings, a bustling main street, its own Masonic lodge, and enough miners to rival the neighboring towns. Today, most of it is gone. Ruins of cabins, stone foundations, a few weather-beaten houses with collapsed roofs. Some say the only thing that keeps the place alive is the Masonic Lodge, which still operates despite the town being otherwise empty. Alex and his two friends arrived late in the day, their boots crunching over gravel as they hiked into the ghostly remains. The air was thin, their breath puffing white in the crisp October chill. The sun fell fast behind the ridges, leaving long shadows across the ruins. They wandered from one structure to another, photographing broken window frames, collapsed porches, and the eerie stillness that seemed to press down harder with each step. It was near the edge of the town that they spotted a two-story house, more intact than the rest. Its siding was grayed, the porch sagging, but its roof still clung stubbornly, and the windows on the upper floor were mostly unbroken. What caught their attention, though, was the door. Unlike others, it wasn't hanging open or padlocked. It was nailed shut from the outside, long rusted nails hammered deep into the frame, as though someone wanted to keep people, or something, inside. "Bet it's still got stuff in it," one of his friends, Jared, muttered. They hesitated only briefly before prying the nails with a crowbar they'd brought. The wood groaned in protest, the nails squealing free one by one. When the final one popped, the door creaked inward, stale air flooding out. Inside, dust choked the hallway. Their flashlights caught peeling wallpaper, a toppled chair, a stairwell climbing into blackness. The house smelled of old wood and damp, with a faint metallic tang Alex couldn't place. They stepped carefully, the boards whining underfoot. Most of the rooms downstairs were as expected, decayed, half-empty, with debris scattered across the floor. But when they tried the door at the back of the hall, they found it locked. Unlike the exterior, this one wasn't nailed, it was simply sealed tight, the brass knob cold to the touch. Curiosity flared. They tried shoulder barging it. Nothing. Finally, Jared rammed the crowbar into the frame and pried. The door gave suddenly, swinging inward with a groan, and the three froze in the threshold. The room inside was immaculate. Unlike the rest of the house, there was no dust, no decay. The wallpaper still clung, patterned in faded rows. A table stood in the center, chairs neatly pushed in. A mantel clock ticked faintly above the fireplace, its brass pendulum swinging, keeping perfect time. Alex's flashlight shook in his hand. On the table, a half-finished meal sat waiting, plates with dried bread, utensils set, a glass of water untouched. And on the mantel, family photographs stared out, their frames polished, as if someone still tended them. Curiosity flared. They tried shoulder barging it. Nothing. Finally,
Jared rammed the crowbar into the frame and pried. The door gave suddenly, swinging inward with a groan. And the three froze in the threshold. The room inside was immaculate. Unlike the rest of the house, there was no dust, no decay. The wallpaper still clung, patterned in faded rows. A table stood in the center, chairs neatly pushed in. A mantel clock ticked faintly above the fireplace, its brass pendulum swinging, keeping perfect time. Alex's flashlight shook in his hand. On the table, a half-finished meal sat waiting, plates with dried bread, utensils set, a glass of water untouched. And on the mantel, family photographs stared out, their frames polished, as if someone still tended them. "This isn't possible," whispered the third friend, Leah. Alex stepped in slowly, every nerve screaming at him not to. His boots left clear tracks on the floorboards, boards that showed no other footprints, as if no one had entered for decades. The air was warm in here, unlike the biting chill outside. Almost cozy. Tick, tick, tick. The sound of the clock burrowed into his ears, impossibly steady. He touched the glass of water on the table. Cool. Beads of condensation slid down the side, fresh as if poured moments before. He backed up, pulse hammering. That's when the whispers began. Faint at first, like wind brushing walls, then clearer. Words, layers of voices speaking too low to understand, overlapping, filling the room with a sound that had no source. Leah grabbed his sleeve. "Do you hear that?" The whispers rose, pressing in from every side. The photographs on the mantel seemed to blur. For a moment, Alex swore the faces changed, expressions tightening, eyes shifting to meet his own. The clock ticked faster. Tick, tick, tick. Then the door slammed shut behind them. They spun, flashlight beams cutting the room, but the knob wouldn't budge. Jared yanked at it, muscles straining. Nothing. The whispers crescendoed, harsh, insistent. Alex raised his camera instinctively, snapping blind. The flash burst white, illuminating the room. For that split second, all three of them saw the table surrounded, not by empty chairs, but by figures. Translucent, blurred, seated in silence, heads slowly turning toward them. The flash died. The room was empty again. The clock stopped. No tick, just silence thick enough to crush. The doorknob rattled on its own, twisting once, then freezing. The whispers cut off mid-syllable. And the knob released. The three bolted, slamming through the hall, down the porch steps, and into the cold mountain night. None of them looked back until they reached the road. When Alex dared, the house sat dark and silent. No glow, no sound, only a shutter clattered in the wind. He developed his photos weeks later. Most were grainy, crooked, ruined by his shaking hands. But one, the flash photo, showed the dining table with its set plates, and faint around it, the outlines of three seated figures, blurred, translucent, yet unmistakably human. Alex has never published those photos. He says he still hears the clock sometimes, ticking faintly in his sleep. And when people ask if he'll return to Nevadaville, he shakes his head. Once, he says, was enough.
The fourth story comes from Animas Forks, a settlement high in the San Juan Mountains where the winters once buried houses to their roofs. Today, it's nothing but creaking frames, peeling siding, and the howl of wind through shattered windows. But one hiker swears that when dusk fell, he met someone there who shouldn't have been able to walk away. And before we begin, if these stories keep you hooked, subscribe and ring the bell. I share new chilling encounters every single day. This account comes from Thomas, an avid hiker and amateur historian who traveled the Rockies every summer. He'd been to Animas Forks once, in daylight, with a tour group, but he wanted to see the town when it was truly deserted, without tourists snapping photos and children darting across creaking porches. He returned in September, parking his truck near the trailhead and setting out late in the day, knowing the sun would dip behind the ridges fast, leaving him with a sliver of twilight. The town unfolded like a broken postcard, false-fronted houses listing into the dirt, rusted iron scattered from collapsed machinery, and the skeletal shell of the Duncan house standing proudly against the ridge. The air was thin, sharp with the metallic tang of altitude and the faint, ever-present scent of wet pine. Thomas wandered slowly, camera slung over his shoulder, snapping shots of warped siding, fractured glass, and the endless gray boards that seemed to hum with the memory of human life. By the time the sun dipped, he had made his way to the main street, which cut like a scar through the heart of the ruins. The shadows deepened, and the wind picked up, slipping through gaps in window frames with a low, flute-like wail. He pulled his jacket tighter and debated turning back. But that was when he saw him. A man, walking at the far end of the street. Thomas blinked, convinced that first it was another late visitor, someone like himself. The figure moved steadily down the middle of the road, head slightly bowed, a coat buttoned to the chin. He carried himself with a certain stiffness, like someone used to the weight of formality. As he drew closer, Thomas realized what was strange: the man's clothing. He wore trousers tucked into worn leather boots, a long wool coat, and a hat with a wide, flat brim, fashion that belonged not to 2009, but to the 1880s. His beard was trimmed neatly, his face weathered but stern, his eyes shadowed under the brim. Thomas hesitated, lifting a hand. "Hey there!" The man looked up briefly, and in the fading light, his eyes glinted pale gray. "Evening," he said, voice low, measured. Thomas swallowed, unnerved but trying to be polite. "Didn't expect anyone else up here this late." The man stopped a few yards away. "I could say the same." His words carried the weight of another century, formal and deliberate. Thomas tried to laugh it off. "Guess we're both chasing history, huh?" The man's mouth twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "History. Yes." He glanced toward the houses, then back. "Do you know the way to Silverton?" Thomas blinked. Silverton lay 10 miles down the valley, accessible only by rugged road. He pointed vaguely downhill. "You'd have to follow the trail back, then drive. Not really walkable." The man frowned slightly. "No, not that way. The other." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. "Other?" The man tilted his head, as if listening to something Thomas couldn't hear. The wind rose, tugging at his coat, stirring dust across the boards. For a moment, Thomas swore the buildings behind them seemed sharper, less ruined, as if the town itself leaned closer to listen. Then the man straightened, eyes fixing on Thomas. "It doesn't matter. Thank you." He tipped his hat faintly, then stepped past, boots crunching in the dirt. Thomas turned, watching him walk. His pace never faltered, his shoulders squared, his steps measured. He passed the last house on the street, his outline silhouetted briefly against the darkening sky. Then he was gone. Not vanished instantly, but simply gone. One step he was there, the next, the road was empty. Thomas blinked hard, heart thudding. He jogged forward, scanning the road, the houses, the slope. Nothing. Only wind carrying through the ruins. He forced himself to breathe, telling himself he'd imagined it, that the fading light had tricked his eyes. But when he lifted his camera to take one last shot of the street, his stomach dropped. Through the lens, the houses no longer sagged. The Duncan house windows gleamed with intact glass. The saloon's porch stood straight, lanterns glowing faintly within. And in the center of the street, for just an instant, the man stood again, facing Thomas this time, eyes glinting in the dim light, mouth moving silently. Thomas ripped the camera from his eye. The street was empty again, ruined, broken, as it should be.
He packed his gear with shaking hands and hurried back to the truck. When he reached the trailhead, he glanced back once more. The town lay silent in the growing night, but in the highest window of the Duncan house, a faint light glowed, steady and unnatural, just as he had seen in the lens. He drove down the mountain in near darkness, not daring to stop until Silverton's lights appeared in the valley. To this day, he avoids showing that photograph to anyone, because when he developed it, the image burned itself into him. The Duncan house stood whole, windows unbroken, the street alive with lantern light, and the man stood in the foreground, clear as day, staring directly into the lens.